So I have a few stories I'd like to share with you this morning, and our first comes from the African-Cuban tradition. When Olofi created the world, he created everything in it. Everything beautiful and ugly. He created truth and he created falsehood. And in his wisdom, he created truth with a strong body. And he created falsehood, weak and limp. But in that creation, they became enemies. And Olofi gave falsehood a cutlass, a knife to cut. Truth didn't have such a thing. Truth had his big, strong body. But the two of them fought, and they fought viciously. They fought for dominance over one another. And falsehood swiped at truth with his cutlass and cut off his head. It went rolling across the ground, and truth was, of course, enraged by this and a little befuddled. He felt around on the ground, searching for his head, and in his stumbling, he knocked falsehood over. And then he felt falsehood's head and pulled. And because he had such a strong body, that head, it came right off, and truth stuck it right on top of his body. And this is how we come to have a strong, powerful truth in the world that sometimes can be led astray by falsehood. No. Excellent. I'll tell you where you can find one. Yes, or you can have mine. I'll get another one. So my boys and I like to watch the TV show Once Upon a Time. Has anybody seen this show? Yeah, it's really fun. And the basic premise, for those of you who are not familiar, is that fairy tales, they involve real people who actually live, who through a curse and a kind of twist of fate, or several twists once you're a few seasons in, have come to their current modern world where their stories are told in new, really interesting ways. The past, their past, continues to inform their lives, but they've adapted to their new lives, and now they have these new tales that they get to create and pursue. And so in preparing for today, I was sitting on the couch, I was watching our show, and I was thinking about how different my life now looks compared to, say, 3 years ago or 6 years ago, 18, 30. The number gets higher and higher. There were no curses that I know of that played a role in my life, but plenty of twists of fate. Like most of you, I've been many things throughout my lifetime to many people. Hero, villain, scullery maid, princess, an innocent, a knave. The tales that make up a life, after all, are simultaneously one long thread, and at the same time woven by the weft and warp of many threads of my being, that shadow and light, the remarkable and the mundane. So I'd like to share one of these examples with you. Once upon a time, last November, a woman no longer so young as to be called a girl, but still relatively new to the life she had chosen, embarked upon a quest for silence and solitude. I'd been living in my expanded family of 5 people for about 3 years, and the daily ups and downs of so many people so close in had begun to take its toll. The self-care strategies I had once relied upon were no longer working. I was escaping into my phone. I was escaping into a glass of wine far too often. It just wasn't working anymore. I felt exhausted and overwhelmed and unable to please anyone, much less everyone. I was maybe a modern-day Cinderella, or maybe the modern-day evil stepsister in my own head, in a house of my own making. I was maybe the old woman who lived in a shoe with too many children. She didn't know what to do. Whatever the case, I wanted to escape. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. I wanted to think uninterrupted. And so I signed up for a 5-day silent retreat, and in early November, I made the drive to Brighton Bush Hot Springs, and I arrived late and harried and overextended and overwhelmed and totally consumed by fears and anxiety and internal fairy tales warning me of imminent danger. I was terrified, and that's how I remained, at least at first. During our retreat, we were instructed in and encouraged to practice meditation, starting at 6 in the morning for 45 to 60 minutes at a time until 10 o'clock at night. It was excruciating. I was really restless, and then I would fall asleep sitting in place. I felt super angry at myself and at the retreat center, at the guy who was leading us through this meditation practice. I wanted to check my email pretty desperately. I wanted to call my family. I questioned my sanity in desiring silence in the first place. Noise wasn't nearly as bad as the feeling I was going through inside my own head. It was day 4 before I felt any relief. I sat and paid attention to my breath, moving in and out of my lungs, the way that our teacher had instructed us to do. I allowed my in-breath to bring love into myself, and my out-breath to breathe love into the rest of the world. I'm going to share a second story with you. This one comes from Finland. At first, there were only primal waters and sky. But Sky also had a daughter named Ilmatar, and one day she was seeking a resting place. She descended to the waters, and there she swam and floated for 700 years, until she noticed a beautiful bird also searching for a resting place. Ilmatar raised her knee toward the bird so that it could land, and it did. The bird laid 6 eggs made of gold and 1 made of iron there on her knee. The bird incubated her eggs on Ilmatar's knee, and the knee grew warmer and warmer. Eventually, she began to be burned by the heat, and so she responded by jolting her leg. This motion dislodged the eggs, which then fell and shattered into the waters. Land was formed from the lower part of one of those eggshells. The sky formed from the top. The egg whites turned into the moon and the stars. The yolk became the sun. Ilmatar continued to float in the waters for several hundred years more, admiring the results of these events, but she could not resist an urge to continue creation. Her footprints became pools for fish. By simply pointing, she created contours in the land. In this way, she made everything that is. Being that each of us is made of primal waters, blood and bile and sweat and tears, I'm beginning to believe that we have these same powers to sculpt and urge new life, new stories, new possibilities, new meaning into being. As I said, on the 4th day of my silent retreat, I found a little peace and a little clarity. It felt like I'd been sitting for 700 years. But by focusing my attention on my breath, I had finally allowed myself to relax. It was amazing. It was glorious. There was no discomfort, no yearning, no judgment, no anxiety. When the bell rang out to call us back into the room, I didn't want to come. I did not want to come back. It had been as if I were suspended in no time. But the sit was over, and soon it was time to go home. What I brought home with me from my quest was that tiny grain of truth and peace. And since now I know it exists, most morning I continue my quest. I started to tell you each morning I do this, but that would be a lie. Most mornings, though, I practice. When I do sit, I don't reach that same state very often. My mind whirls and my breath isn't nearly as interesting as I feel it should be to keep my attention. But when I do, it allows me the possibility of a fairy tale beginning each new morning. The obstacles within my own psyche offering plenty of fodder to fuel my quest. I sit with the intention of creating space for silence, for allowing the truth of right now to be a companion and a guide.